We will welcome Holly Goddard Jones. Thanks so much.
Hello, hi. Alex and I hope you don't mind my saying this, we're just talking about how nervous we are, but I, really excited to, is this in a good spot? Okay. I feel like I've said to a couple of people, I feel like I've been on the edge of sort of happy, overwhelmed tears all week because it's so rattling and surreal and lovely to be among people again and to be doing what we're getting to do. And people were really patiently playing with my rowdy children at the lawn games, which is so kind. And my daughter was pulling up the little croquet hoop things right as they were being placed in the correct way. And so thank you for that and for what they do later on. I can't say what that will be. So thank you. Thanks to Leah for having me here. I love coming here. I love coming to Sewanee. It's my first time at the conference, but I've been in town a few times before. And Gwen and Adam for all the work you do, the great staff, the great participants. Thank you all. I am going to read from a story called Antipodes, which, if I have any advice to dispense, please name your stories in your books something you can feel confident pronouncing, because it's been a real source of stress for me. And it's also the title of the collection that's going to come out with this story as the first one in it. I'll just say briefly that I've long been a fan of fabulous, weird, surreal fiction, and my students were bringing it to me for a number of years, my graduate students. So I was enjoying reading it, but never writing it. It never occurred to me to write a fabulous story. And the experience of having graduate students bring me their work and trying to figure out, okay, how can I help them make this the best thing it can be, made me think about the subgenre more and what could be really interesting about it. And then 2016 happened, and my daughter was born in late November. It was a kind of heady, hormonal, tumultuous time for everyone. Well, maybe not hormonal for everyone, but the other adjectives certainly. And it suddenly felt to me like fabulism was exactly the vehicle I needed to tell the kind of stories that I needed to tell. So this story is a consequence of that, and you might feel this, but it owes, I think, a debt of gratitude in terms of inspiration to Jeff Vandermeer and Kelly Link. And I think I've talked enough about it. So I will only be able to read about half of it. Antipodes. We built the temple on the site of the sinkhole, which had itself been the site of the National Corvette Museum. You may have seen it on the news a few years back, the washed-out security footage, first of the cars, rainbow-colored, gleaming in the low light, entombed like pharaohs, and then the floor disappears, revealing a column of inky nothing, and the cars drop into it. The video is soundless, peaceful even. No shrieking of grinding metal, crackle of fiberglass, rumble of disturbed earth. No one ever heard the cars hit bottom. The prevailing theory is that they reached the magma layer and melted to nothing, but I picture them falling and falling and falling, dropping through a secret hole on the other side of the earth, then rising, cars turned rockets, and shooting up into space. But I am fanciful. Raising kids will do that to you. There had been talk of rebuilding the museum, but in the end, no one wanted to take the risk. The National Corvette Foundation donated the land back to the city of Bowling Green, and the city promptly put it up for sale. As you might imagine, there wasn't a lot of interest in a 30-acre lot with a 50-foot circular abyss in its center. Even developers who had otherwise leveled the city into a maze of 3-bedroom houses with 2-car garages steered clear. You can be sure the Daily News made use of that pun in a headline or two. Most big ideas have obscure or controversial origins. Even today, with social media as a record, you can do a digital excavation on the history of the temple and find more to confuse than illuminate you. I am the historian, and I was one of the founding planners, and even I couldn't say for sure if the idea for the temple started with Richard or Keisha or Deshawn or Wendy or Elsa or Connor. Sometimes it still seems possible that the idea for the temple was mine, and I believe I can remember the night it came to me when I was lying on the floor beside the baby's crib, arm pinned between slats, rubbing circles onto her hot little belly while she snuffled and hitched. Yes, I can remember that moment vividly, the thin baby blanket across my legs, stuffed animal as a pillow under my head, yeasty smell of the baby's soiled diaper, and the question of whether to wake her to change it. And then it came to me, whole, a vision, a temple to hide the sinkhole, to keep watch over it, a column of white stone reaching up to the sky to negate the darkness. It seemed to me for a long time that this was my vision, my message from God. But later, when Richard was appointed head priest, I came to believe that my vision was a false memory. And anyway, as Richard says, the concept of ownership, even of an idea, runs counter to the whole project of the temple. We may as well just rebuild the Corvette Museum, he says, if that's to be our mindset. I'm going to call the meeting to order, Richard says. There are days when we are confused about our purpose. Are we meeting or are we worshiping? Are we a congregation or a committee? There are 7 of us present, as I note carefully in the minutes, enough to fit around the oblong table in the conference room with 5 seats to spare. Richard stands at the head of the table. He pretends gently to hammer a gavel. He doesn't have a costume or uniform, but he favors on his temple days a priest-adjacent getup of black button-down shirt and dark pressed trousers. He wears little wire-framed glasses and gel in his short-cropped hair. He reeks of Old Spice. Any new business? He asks. We look at each other, shrug. It's all new business and no business. Now that the temple is erected, the holy vision realized, we are trying not to admit that a next step has not revealed itself to us. The agenda Richard sent us last week by email had 2 line items. 1, new business. 2, discussion to formulate an agenda. Keisha unscrews the cap on her Coke Zero and it hisses, drawing everyone's attention. Yes, Keisha? Richard asks. But I wasn't. She stops, clears her throat. Well, we could talk about a name for the temple, or for us, whatever we are. What are we? Wendy asks. Are we a church? We are still in the process of filing for 501c3 tax-exempt status, Richard tells her. Then will we be a church? Deshawn asks. I don't believe in God, Connor says. Elsa, as always, rolls her eyes. Why are you even here? Whoever said this has anything to do with God? Connor asked. This is the conversation every time. An hour in, Deshawn, who is the group's optimist, makes a motion to name the temple the Church of the Sinkhole, and Keisha, who seconds everything, seconds him. Richard moves to discussion, and Elsa's hand springs into the air. That would be like saying you go to the Church of the Devil. You don't name the church after your enemy. Who says the sinkhole's our enemy? Connor asks. There's a Church of Satan, Keisha offered. Satans are just atheists trolling the government, Connor says. We're here to watch the sinkhole, I say, and a hush falls over the group because I rarely speak. It isn't our enemy or our friend. Neither is God, for that matter. Now you're just being blasphemous. Elsa knits her pale reddish eyebrows. Of course God's our friend. You like your friends. You fear your God, I say. I have brought Stella to the meeting, strapped to my chest in a sling. Stella comes with me almost everywhere, not because I am a proponent of attachment parenting, but because I have 2 older children and too much to do, and I need my hands free. She is about 18 months old now. Her thin, pale hair is pasted in damp strands across her broad, creamy forehead. Her green eyes are closed, lashes heavy against her cheeks, and her right hand is clamped around a blue poker chip, which has become something of a lovey to her in recent weeks. She might sleep for another half hour if I'm lucky, and I resent spending her precious nap time like this, arguing inanities. She's right, Richard says. We're guardians, or perhaps gatekeepers. That's what got this temple built in the first place. People need to know someone's worrying about the sinkhole so they don't have to. What good can we possibly do, Connor says. What does any of this mean? Are we just going to be the first to fall in the hole if it widens? When it widens, Keisha says coldly. So we're just watching it, Deshawn says. He sounds relieved rather than doubtful. He likes the fact that today's talk has produced an answer, however vague. We study it, I say. We appease it, Richard says. I was going through what my husband called a rough patch when I found myself in a Discord community with Richard and the others who would become the founding planners. It's another thing I can't clearly remember, how I ended up there. I wasn't a gamer, but I did spend a lot of time in the early AM hours staring at my phone while the baby nursed or fussed, or during the nightly bouts of insomnia I suffered in those days. Half awake, I would click link after link, jabbing my thumb, switching between apps, Facebook to Twitter to Instagram to Chrome. There was a lot of that in late 2016, everywhere. A lot of insomnia, a lot of middle-of-the-night internet searches and desperate conspiring, people looking for purpose, people trying to figure out, via the right Google search, how to stave off disaster. There is no other way to say this. I became convinced in the weeks after Stella's birth that I had a hole in my head. It sounds like a joke, but it was not a joke to me then, and it still doesn't feel funny to me now. It started at the hospital the night of her birth. Money was tight, and we didn't have family nearby, so my husband went home to be with our older kids, Meg and Elias. I didn't mind. I had a book to read, a baby to breastfeed, and I knew to expect a night of regular interruptions from hospital staff, which would infuriate Joseph and inspire him to a grumpiness worse than the broken sleep. I settled in to endure it. I was drifting, dozing, the baby on my chest. I knew in a faraway way that the nurse would jolt me awake if she found me like this, scold me for sleeping with Stella in the bed, when I felt a sort of itchy, crawling sensation on the base of my skull. Automatically, I put a hand back there to scratch and felt it, a scaly patch, perhaps the size of a pencil eraser. I scratched it gently with my fingernail. The rough skin started to flake away, painlessly. I kept going, wanting it all gone, wanting to feel smooth nothingness beneath my finger pad. At last, finally, I could feel no more loose skin, but what my excavation had revealed was even worse, a cool, slightly sunken circle of flesh. There wasn't even hair growing out of it. The crawling sensation from before was back, but it was in my brain now, an ugly thought that wormed its way through the folded lobes. It whispered, cancer, melanoma, tumor, and I held Stella tightly with my free hand, my breath constricted. What if I wasn't around to see her grow up? What would she do without a mom? The transition from sleepy calm to panic was almost instantaneous, and this too seemed like proof of the truth of my instinct. The feeling was so strong I had to stop myself from calling Joseph, demanding that he abandon our kids and return immediately to the hospital. I was not able, however, to stop myself from hitting the call button to summon the nurse. I might have been crying by this point. My head, I said, leaning over and pointing. There's something on the back of my head. She was a big woman, broad and doughy, with hair sculpted into one of those elaborate meringue-like sweeps you see on Pentecostals. Her lip curled. Like a bug? No, just look at it, please. Something's wrong. She turned on the bright overhead light and hesitantly parted my hair. Her fingers gently probed the curve of my skull. I don't see nothing back here. I put a finger insistently on the spot. It was there. I could still feel it, unnaturally round and irrefutable. This, I hissed, this. I just see a tiny scratch spot. Honey, do you want me to take the baby to the nursery so you can get a couple hours sleep? No, I said. You sure? I mopped my eyes with the back of my hand, then shook my head. She peered at me. "Do you need anything for pain? It's been 6 hours since you had a Percocet." "I'm fine," I whispered. "You can't sleep with the baby in the bed," she said. She took Stella from me briskly, propped her down in the scuffed oak bassinet, and rearranged her swaddle in 3 practice sweeps. "Let her lay here a little bit. It'll do you good." "I will," I said, impatient at this point to have the nurse out of the room, now that I knew she'd be no help. In another few minutes, she left, though I could sense her outside the door, hovering, her suspicions alerted. I didn't care. I hobbled to the bathroom. The pad between my legs was soaked, and the artificial ice pack had long ago lost its chill, but I ignored the discomfort, rummaging in my makeup bag for a compact. The pressed powder had a little mirror. I wiped the dust off with my nightgown and held it up to the back of my head, neck twisted, parting my long hair to reveal a window of bare flesh. Craning for a glimpse of it, though all I could see was the occasional patch of pink. I don't know how long the baby was crying before the sound finally registered with me. Long enough for drops of blood to leak from my soaked mesh underwear and spatter the bathroom floor. Long enough for my breasts to marble and leak. Long enough that, once I'd finally changed my pad and ice pack and emerged, the nurse was back, patting Stella and hushing her and watching me with deep concern. "I had to use the toilet," I said. "It hurt pretty bad." "You need to watch your stitches," the nurse said, handing Stella back to me. "I'll get you a stool softener. Could I have some ginger ale too, please?" The mundane nature of my request seemed to reassure her. She smiled. "Sure you can, hon." That night was the beginning, not just of my knowledge of the whole, or what I thought of first as the spot and later as the whole, but of my divided self. There was the self that knew I carried around this wrongness, that I was branded with it. My knowledge of the whole was as certain to me as the knowledge of my love for my children. And then there was the self that knew, or came to understand, that no one else would ever believe me. Not Joseph, who checked the spot for me dozens of times, always with the insistence, "It's raw because you keep scratching it. If you leave it alone, it'll go away." Not the at-home nurse, part of a county program, who visited me a few times a week to weigh the baby and asked me to fill out questionnaires about postpartum depression. Not my gynecologist, who checked the spot after checking between my legs to see how my stitches were faring, then shrugged with indifference. No one believed me, even though the hole was deepening, ever so slightly widening, and by the time Stella was smiling her first smiles, I could insert my pinky finger into it, fully submerging the nail bed. So I learned to pretend. I started taking 100 milligrams of sertraline and 15 milligrams of aripiprazole a day and seeing a psychiatrist. The medicine helped. Sometimes I even believed the hole wasn't there, and the idea of it seemed like an absurd dream. I couldn't figure out where that other certainty came from, why it was so insidious and persistent. But that was only some of the time. The rest of the time, and this was also better, the hole was an uncomfortable fact I could choose to ignore, like my family history of breast cancer, or the fact that we had still not, after 11 years, managed to start Meg a college fund. The therapy didn't help at all. Once my medications were regulated, I stopped mentioning the hole to the doctor. I talked instead vaguely about sadness, about frustration with my husband over his failure to keep up with his end of the household chores. Joseph had warned me, and he was right. If you don't get control of yourself, they're going to try to take Stella away from us. And then, when I found the others in the Discord group, it seemed to me that our united sense of purpose about the sinkhole and the danger it posed, our duty to understand and contain it, did for me what therapy was supposed to do. It helped me to compartmentalize my anxiety about the hole in my head. To even think that the hole in my head had led me to that hole in the earth, had revealed to me my life's real purpose. I realize I haven't been fully honest. One person believed me. Stella was perhaps a month old when I was home alone with just her and my 8-year-old, Elias. Meg had gone with her dad to Walmart to get materials for her science project. Stella was sleeping, and Elias, taking advantage of the little window of solitude, had crawled in my lap to watch a Disney movie. "Elle," I found myself saying, "will you look at something for me?" "Look at what?" he asked. "Something on the back of my head." "Okay," he said. No confusion, no demands for clarification. "Where at?" I lay on my belly on the sofa, and he straddled my back. Cheek pressed to the cushion, I crawled my fingers through my hair until the hole was revealed. The air-conditioned room was cool, and I could feel the chill on the spot, inside it. "Here," I said, pointing. "What do you see?" A silence, his hot breath on my neck. Then a giggle. "You have a hole in your head, Mama." My body broke out in goosebumps. Terror, exaltation, I shuddered with it. "A hole?" I echoed hoarsely. "Can I put my finger in it?" he asked. "I guess so," I told him. Pressure against my skull. He wiggled it, and a nerve somewhere inside me thrummed like a harp string. "How did you get a hole in your head?" Elias asked. "I don't know, buddy." "Do I have a hole in my head?" "No, I don't think you do. Can you look?" It suddenly seemed urgent that I do just that. I sat up, motioned for him to turn around. I ran my fingers across his scalp carefully in overlapping rows. I folded the short hair apart as if checking for lice. His beautiful little crown, blessedly intact, not a blemish, not even a crust of the cradle cap that had plagued him as a toddler. "No hole," I said. "Mama, is your hole hurting you?" "No," I said, and it was true. It hurt me no more than the holes in my mouth or ears hurt me. Was it possible the hole was a part of me? Could an absence, a void, be a part of me? In that moment, Joseph walked in the door with Meg, found me with my hands on Elias's head, and looked at me warily. "What's happening here?" he asked. I rubbed my knuckles across Elias's scalp, making him giggle. "Noogies," I said quickly before Elias could speak. And then, as if she had sensed my need, Stella cried out from upstairs, rescuing me from her father's suspicions, and I went to her, strapped her to my chest, started to fold a basket of clean laundry. And that's where I'll stop. Thank you. So next up is Alex Marzano-Lesnevich. Thank you.
That was amazing. Please, one more round for Holly. All right, thank you, Holly. That was stunning. And thank you to Leah, Gwen, and Adam for inviting me to be part of this glorious space, and all of you for venturing out of your homes and bringing your hearts and creativity and minds here bravely, where we breathe around each other. It's wonderful to be amid writers again. So I'm working on a book called Both and Neither, and I am going to read from an essay that was the kind of spark for the book. I'll read for about 5 minutes from the beginning and 15 minutes from the end, so just know that there's a lot in the middle that happens that's not there. This is called Body Language. I am 8 years old, sitting in my childhood kitchen, ready to watch one of the home videos my father has made. The videotape still exists somewhere, so somewhere she still is that girl on the screen. Hair that tangles, freckles across her nose that in time will spread across one side of her forehead. A body that can throw a baseball the way her father has shown her. A body in which bones and hormones lie in wait, ready to bloom into the wide hips her mother has given her. A body that has scars. The scars over her lungs and heart from the scalpel that saved her when she was a baby. The invisible scars left by a man who touched her when she was young. A body is a record, or a body is freedom, or a body is a battleground. Already, at 8, she knows it to be all three. But somebody has slipped. The school is putting on the musical South Pacific, and there are not enough roles for the girls, and she is as tall or as taller than the boys. And so they have done what is unthinkable in this striving 1980s town, in this place where the men do the driving and the women make their mouths into perfect O's to apply lipstick in the rear view. For the musical, they have made her a boy. No, she thinks. They have allowed her to be a boy. What I remember is the flush I feel as my father loads the tape into the player. Usually, I hate watching videos of myself. Usually, there is this stranger on the screen, this girl with her pastel clothing, and I am supposed to pretend that she is me. And she is. I know she is, but also she isn't. In the 3rd grade, I'll be asked to draw a self-portrait in art class, and for years into the future, when I try to understand where this feeling began, this feeling of not having words to explain what my body is, who I am, I'll remember the shock as I placed my drawing next to my classmates. They'd drawn stick figures with round heads and blonde curls or crew cuts. They'd drawn their families and their dogs and the bright yellow spikes of a sun. One had drawn long hair and the triangle shape of a dress. Another, short hair, jeans. How had they known what they looked like? I had drawn a swirl. Now, in the kitchen, what I notice is that my siblings are squirming in their seats, asking if they can leave, and that I, somehow, am not. I am sitting perfectly still. Is it possible I want to see this video? The feeling is peculiar. I have not yet known the pleasure of taking something intimately mine and watching the world respond. Someday I'll be a writer. Someday I'll love this feeling. But at 8 years old, it's new. My mother hushes my siblings and passes around popcorn. My father takes his spot at the table's head. On screen, the auditorium of an elementary school appears, and at the corner of the stage, plywood palm trees. And then the curtains part, and there I am. My hair slicked back, my ponytail pinned away, a white sailor's cap perched on my head. Without all the hair, my face looks different. Angular, fine-boned. I am wearing a plain white t-shirt tucked into blue jeans, all the frill and fluff of my normal clothing stripped away. All my life, I have felt ungainly, wrong-sized, wrong-shaped. But look, on the screen, there is only ease. I don't know whether the hush I remember spread through the kitchen or only through me. My mother is the first to speak. "You like a good-looking boy," she says. I feel the words I'm not brave enough to say. I know. Soon after, I began to ignore the long hair that marked me so firmly as a girl, leaving it in the same ponytail for days on end until it knotted into a solid dark mass. All my friends were boys, and my dearest hours were spent playing Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles on the lawn with my twin brother and the neighbor boy. My room was blue, and my teddy bear was blue, and the turtle I wanted to be was Leonardo, not only because he was smart, but because his color was blue. One afternoon, when my twin brother yet again went shirtless for a game of catch and I wasn't allowed to, I announced to my father that I didn't want to be a girl, not if being a girl meant I had to wear a shirt. My father went to get my mother. My mother explained that I should be happy to be a girl. There were so many good things about it. I knew there were. That wasn't the problem. The problem was that people kept calling me one. I remember realizing I could not explain this to her. Back then, the word genderqueer, how I now identify, the language that would eventually help me see myself, hadn't yet come to existence in English. The term wouldn't come around for another decade, nor would non-binary, which first appeared in an online forum. Quote, "Do you ever really feel as if you've moved from that non-binary existence as a transsexual into a real man or woman?" So note the way non-binary was positioned from its inception as transitory, as a passing through. It could not itself be a destination, the end to a story. As scholar J. Prosser has written, quote, "Transsexuality is always narrative work, a transformation of the body that requires the remolding of the life into a particular narrative shape. It is the narrative constructed in retrospect, perhaps even more than the body, that makes the self recognizable, even cognizable. But narrative requires language. What word was there for me then that could have conveyed the wrongness of everything?" In the years that followed, I argued with myself over whether I felt trapped, then the dominant narrative of transness, enough to truly be trans. Some days I would decide, yes, and that I'd make the necessary changes to be recognized as a man as soon as I felt brave enough. Other days, I would decide no, never because I didn't feel trapped, but because I wasn't so sure being seen as a man was what would save me. It wasn't that man felt right, it was that women felt wrong. And what was the alternative? When, 20 years after that moment in the kitchen, I finally said who I was out loud, it was to a lover. A woman I'd fallen for the instant I'd seen her sitting in a crowd at a reading, her hair long and curly like mine was, her jacket black leather like mine, her shoulders broadly muscled as mine had never been. She was unabashedly she, hips that swung from side to side when she walked, lips plump and swollen, a lilting accent that drove me mad. On our first date, she showed up in a tie, and I was so flustered and surprised I could scarcely speak all night. Wasn't I supposed to wear the tie? I don't think I said that. I hope I didn't say that. But she must have sensed something, because for the years we were together, she never again wore one. Instead, she donned the stilettos, the fishnet stockings, once a dress so tight that rode so high under the curve of her ass that I nearly followed her around the family party we were attending with a jacket. After we fought so badly we broke up, I found I could not stop thinking about her ass, her lips, the way when she straddled me in bed, her hair swung in my face. The visions lasted for months, a haunting. Finally, I sent a note unsigned in the mail. No name, just words of want. We met at a motel, and still we didn't speak. Just the white sheets, her breast I'd missed so much, the black confection of string knotted into the shape of a flower that revealed itself when I pulled off her clothes. We fucked until we were sweaty, and the sheets were sweaty, and everything smelled like I was home again. Maybe that's what made me brave. I'm not, I whispered, my fingers curled in her hair, my lips to the sweat of her neck. I don't feel like, I've never felt like, and then finally, I don't think I'm a woman. And her, bless her, what did she do? She told me she knew, from the way she felt me swell under her tongue. She told me she could tell from how hard I got and how much I swelled. I didn't have the body of a woman, she said. She'd known it all along. And all right, maybe her response now sounds reductive or essentialist in the way she read identity in the contours of my body. But that's not how her words felt. They liberated me. She was saying that biology need not be assumed as cold, incontrovertible fact that had nothing to do with behavior or want. Rather, it too could be conceptually constructed, seen as reflective proof of who a person was, the body rewritten with the pen of identity. As the cultural historian Thomas Lacour points out, the body is always interpreted. Quote, "The body itself does not produce two sexes," he writes, "let alone two genders. We created these categories. We named them. We drew, we draw the lines that define them." In Lacour's account, until the late 18th century, only men were quite conceived of as a full gender. Women were understood as not quite men, rather than a category unto themselves, defined through difference, through lack. This extended even to the body. The ovaries understood as not quite testes, with no name of their own. The vaginal canal understood as the inverted and undescended sheath of the penis. Lacour, and more recent scholars, like Leah Devone, argue that the telling of sex in Genesis, Eve created from Adam's rib, need not have led to an understanding of a different category in the cultural imagination, only a difference of degree. What wasn't quite a man was a woman. If someone with female-looking genitalia behaved in a way that was more like a man, if she had the assurance understood to be the domain of men, if she wished to have a profession, like the writer George Sand or the artist Rosa Bonheur, if she wore trousers and seduced women, she was thought to be an androgyne or hermaphrodite. Her genitalia might look the same when examined by a doctor, as they often were, and one imagines horribly. But the explanation then was that medicine itself just couldn't yet see the difference. Her behavior was an amalgamation, her body therefore must be as well. Behavior, how one wished to live. The story began from this origin. Desire mapped itself onto the body. And look, I don't ever want to deny the oppression and policing of that period. Yet the privileging of desire and of behavior reminds me of the freedom I felt from that past lover's response. After that night in the motel, we invented language of our own, stories spun from our bodies in bed. Neither of us had yet heard the term non-binary nor the term genderqueer. Our understanding of what trans meant was still beholden to the binary, and so neither of us could say then whether I was trans. Only that I didn't feel like a woman, so I wasn't one. She said my body was different, and I believe that to her, under her touch, it was. In time, hormones would do the work of her tongue. In time, hair clippers and binders would do the work of her gaze. But back then, it was her. And what she saw helped me see myself. 5 years ago, I went to get my headshot taken. My hair was long then, and the photographer's stylist straightened it with a blow dryer and a brush, and then individually recurled each curl with a wand. The makeup artist applied lip pencil as close to my lip color as he could find. I became a facsimile of myself. I looked older, I looked harder. I looked for all the world like a true crime writer from New Jersey, which is, I suppose, one version I could tell of my life. The photograph that resulted appears on the hardcover jacket of my first book, which is a memoir. The name on that book is a name I don't use anymore. The portrait is of me, it is deeply not me. The French psychologist and philosopher Jacques Lacan posited that it is in a child's infancy that, upon encountering of a reflection of themselves in a mirror or window, they are introduced to apperception, the idea that they themselves are not only a self, but an object that is viewed and interpreted by others. In this way, the moment of recognition in the mirror is also a moment of splintering, from the private self to the self that is apprehensible to the other. This moment of alienation never resolves. There instead develops a state of subjectivity, a mediation by the outside world, an awareness of being perceived. Quote, "Even in my own mind, I have erased myself." The writer LaTanya McQueen muses, thinking of the times she has picked up a piece of fiction and begun to read it, and assumed all the while that the characters are white, when she herself identifies as mixed race. What does it mean not to exist in your own imagination? And what does it mean to live like that for so long that you assume it is the only way? The headshot is a very expensive thing I will never use again. A very expensive monument to my last attempt to conform to a binary that never suited me. A monument to a change that took a long time to come and then arrived very swiftly, and then I do not think will ever change back. So what the photograph really is a portrait of limited risk. I was trusting you, the reader, with one story of my life. I was not ready to be open about another. That March, I finally cut off my hair. I was in Sydney on the other side of the world, and I made an appointment with a barber whose cuts I'd seen on Instagram. I walked in and asked her to shear the curly hair that was well past my shoulders. "Use the clippers," I said. For the first time in my life, I felt the buzz against my scalp. Afterward, I suppose I was in shock. I nearly cried. As I walked the streets, unsure of where I should go, unsure of this body I now found myself in, I passed a men's clothing store whose window displays I admired days before. I went in. I left several hours later holding 2 bags that contained nearly a month's salary of clothing, neatly folded. I wore some of that clothing on the plane home, 22 hours in a button-down shirt and stiff blazer. On 2 different continents, airport security called me sir, and then again, seeing something in a second glance, "I'm sorry, ma'am." I did not correct them either way. At home, I introduced myself to new people as Alex and asked them to use the gender-neutral pronouns they, them. My driver's license had expired, so I went to the DMV. Waiting for my ticket number to be called, I snapped a photograph of my expired license, of the woman of 10 years ago, with her long curly hair and her wide grin, her shirt falling off one shoulder to expose a bra strap, her dangling earrings. That woman would confess herself to a lover 4 years later. Sitting in the DMV, I took a selfie, the skin of my scalp under the fade, my shirt buttoned to the collar, unsmiling. I posted it to Instagram with the caption, "Gender is a social construct." At some point, I realized that I didn't and don't believe in narrow rules of what counts as trans, and I don't want to transition to a binary place where I would be perceived as male. For so long, I thought that was the only option, and then I was stuck because that idea didn't feel right either. The only time I am ever emotionally attached to my chest is when I imagine someone taking a knife to it. Yet binders leave me headachy and unable to breathe. I would love to change the countless small facial signifiers that lead people to sort me as female, and yet doctors caution it's impossible to predict how quickly the body will respond to even low doses of testosterone. It took me 11 years to make that choice. Now I watch weekly as my body changes. I don't want to pass as man any more than I want to pass as a woman. I don't want to be perceived as either because I am not either. I wish to be seen. I am far from the only queer person to have been liberated by a loosening of the binary. The last few years have seen a steady exhalation of comings out. I have come to think of the questions that followed my own in terms of the numbers of drinks required for people to ask them. There are the one-drink questions like, so you prefer Alex now for everything? Or even, is this the beginning of a transition? And then there are the questions that arrive only after a friend has embraced me, has sat across from me in a warm-wooded bar, has ordered one drink and then another. I feel comfortable with you, they sometimes begin, and smile at me or reach a hand across the table for a squeeze. The words that come next never feel spontaneous somehow, but mannered, as though they have been sitting just beneath the surface and are not for me, or not only for me, but for the changing times and language we live in. Because I feel comfortable with you, I trust I can ask you this. I haven't had anyone else to ask. They sip. I know I'm supposed to use gender-neutral pronouns for you now, but I've known you as a woman for such a long time. Am I really supposed to think of you differently now? And then a moment later, after perhaps more studying alcohol, I mean, what am I supposed to think of you as? This is a risky political moment to identify as trans, while questioning the universality of the narratives that have long dominated the public imagination of transgenderism. In many parts of the country, more than ever before, binary trans people are finally recognized, able to be seen as who they are. But just 7 months into 2021, it is already the worst year of anti-trans legislation on record, with 17 new anti-trans laws passed and 250 bills introduced. This isn't merely a rollback of protections. It's a war, an attempt to legislate a group of people out of existence by making it too precarious for them to live. Murders of trans people, particularly Black trans women, have climbed over the past decade. 2020 was the deadliest year yet, with at least 44 people murdered. But so far, 2021 appears headed to be even worse. Taya Ashton, shot to death just 6 days ago in Suitland, Maryland on July 17th, was at least the 31st trans person murdered just this year. Under these circumstances, it's difficult to say that the categories that have helped so many people be seen and see themselves, categories that are now threatened, that must be defended as legitimate, might still be too restrictive for some, like me. To ask not just for protections for those for whom the gender binary feels true, but also for those of us who have had to find language that transcends it. To ask for and claim language of our own. That language, I know, takes time. Recently, a man stopped me in a stairwell. "You had more hair when we met," he said. His tone was friendly, but I was immediately wary. I mean, I didn't just have less hair. Addressed differently, I went by a different first name, a name I often had to correct him about. I had different pronouns I kept having to ask him to respect. I looked subtly different, the hormones having begun their work. "So when did you decide to cut it?" he said. How could I answer? With what few words could I convey the complexity of a life? I had decided with every step away from the binary, every step toward being comfortable with myself. We've never had a narrative for who I am, but I am trying now trying with language, trying to tell this story in a way I and others can understand, a way that figures the middle as the destination. I thought back to the child I was, the one who knew that girl didn't quite fit, who liked the look of boy and couldn't yet know that it wouldn't quite fit either. The child who didn't have the language and would need to write and live and feel a way into it, wait for society to invent the very words that would allow them to be seen. All I said was, when I was 8. Thank you.